Hi, everyone. My name is Yoshikuni, Professor of Political Science at the Tohoku University. I'll be serving as a moderator of this seminar. And today we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Phillip LIPSCY, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. And also he's the director of the Center for the Study of Global Japan. Okay, now, so please, Professor LIPSCY, would you give us your presentation?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I will open my slides. So it's a great pleasure to address such a knowledgeable audience about energy policy making. So this is a project I'm working on in collaboration with several co-authors who I will talk about very shortly on the institutional politics of energy transitions. So the broad puzzle that motivates this research project is what determines the scope and nature of energy transitions across different countries. And the key empirical approach that we use is to leverage the 1970s oil shocks and use that as an external shock that affected many countries simultaneously, and then from that draw implications for contemporary energy transitions related to climate change. Towards the end of the presentation, I'll also discuss some implications for Japanese energy policy making, given the audience whom I'm sure is very interested in how this speaks to Japanese energy policy. So my co-authors on this project are Jared Finnegan at Princeton, Jonas Meckling at UC Berkeley, and Florence Metz. And we've received generous support from Robert Cohen's Balzan Prize. So that support is gratefully acknowledged. As you can see, it's a very international project focusing on many different countries with scholars who bring different types of expertise to the project. So the basic theory that we propose is that political institutions affect the degree and nature of energy transitions that happen across different countries. And we focus on two mechanisms, insulation and compensation. And I'll talk about these in greater detail in the following slides. And we focus on two policy tools, broadly speaking, demand-side policies, which involve imposing costs on energy consumers in the form of things like gasoline taxes and carbon taxes to basically reduce the consumption of energy in general, or fossil fuel energy, undesirable kinds of energy. There's also supply-side policies, which instead of imposing costs on consumers, impose costs on producers. So these would be things like fuel economy standards and clean energy mandates. So these are the broad categories that I'll be speaking about today. So we examine three political options that governments have when they're faced with the need for a significant energy transition. The first option is to basically ignore resistance to the energy transition. So in any significant transition of a country's energy system, there are going to be some actors who will resist because they're going to be economic losers. So for example, if you're transitioning away from oil, oil producers or oil-intensive industries might try to stop the transition. So governments sometimes can ignore those types of interests who are resisting change. But another option is to pay off or compensate the losers. And finally, there's an option of doing nothing, to essentially give up on the transition and retreat from implementing a transition at all. So we broadly characterize patterns of energy transitions into these three categories. We focus on four political institutions, and each of them occupies a specific role in our analysis. The first is electoral rules, and again, each of these I'll describe in greater detail in the following slides. Electoral rules, in our view, play the role of insulating politicians from consumer interests, the losers from demand side policy measures. Welfare state institutions, social compensation schemes, can compensate for those costs and basically placate consumers who might otherwise resist energy transitions. On the supply side, we look at bureaucratic insulation. So this is the delegation of authority to bureaucratic actors who might be able to achieve a certain degree of insulation from producer interests. And finally, we look at interest intermediation institutions, things like corporatism, that create a consensus around transition and allow for transition through compensatory mechanisms. Our argument is that if you have these institutions, it's possible to achieve energy transitions, but without these types of institutions, countries often face difficulty. And again, I'll talk in greater detail. But it's not only an either or, so it's not just that some countries transition and some don't, but these institutions also determine the patterns of energy transition. So what do we mean? So there's a very large literature in political science that argues that electoral rules, the way politicians are elected through elections, determine the degree to which politicians are sensitive to backlash from voters versus organized interest groups. And one general finding from this literature is that in more proportional electoral systems, politicians aren't quite as worried about backlash from voters as systems that are more majoritarian, in which you need close to 50% of the vote in order to be elected. So proportional electoral rules, we argue, increase the ability of governments to accelerate energy conservation and energy transition through the use of demand-side measures like gasoline taxes and carbon taxes, because politicians aren't as afraid that by raising taxes, voters will punish them in the next election and remove them from office. And we see this most prominently probably in the politics of the United States, where oftentimes gasoline taxes are considered the third rail of US politics. And the third rail in this context means something that's untouchable. And it comes from, in the United States, there are train tracks, and there's always a third rail that is the track that sends electricity to the train. And if you touch it, you get electrocuted. And so in American politics, it's often considered that raising gasoline taxes will basically mean political suicide. And we argue that an important reason for this is because the US uses a very majoritarian electoral rule, and politicians are very sensitive to voter backlash. And so here's one example from the oil shock period, where we compared the relative average price of gasoline and electricity before and after the oil shock. And one thing that we find, and we do somewhat more sophisticated things that I'll talk about later, that basically countries with more proportional electoral systems were more able to increase gasoline prices and electricity prices compared to countries that adopted single-member district or majoritarian electoral systems. So if you have a majoritarian electoral system, that means politicians are very sensitive to consumers and voters, but they do have the option of potentially compensating consumers. So this basically means you're going to impose gasoline taxes or higher costs of energy consumption, but to compensate consumers, you provide them with unemployment insurance or other types of social welfare spending. And so a good example of this in the oil shock period was France, which had a majoritarian electoral system, but it also had very strong welfare state institutions that went back to the early and mid 20th century. And there's a long historical story behind this. For example, the acquisition of Alsace-Lorraine from Germany led to the incorporation of German social welfare institutions into France. But the long story short is, in France, during the oil shocks, gasoline prices were raised very quickly, but you also saw double-digit annual expansion in social welfare spending. So French consumers protested against higher energy taxes, but they also received very generous benefits from the government. So ultimately, they were willing to tolerate higher energy costs. On the producer side, an important variable that we focus on is bureaucratic insulation. And the idea here is that you can delegate authority to a strong autonomous bureaucracy, kind of like central banks, independent central banks in monetary policy. And this, by insulating the bureaucrats from interest group politics, you can accelerate industrial energy transition. And again, in the oil shock period, I think France, with its very powerful bureaucracy, often called the dirigist state, was able to promote nuclear energy very aggressively, unlike many other countries. And in Japan, of course, you have the role of MITI in pushing energy efficiency policy and supply diversification. So those would be two examples where an autonomous bureaucracy was very important in pushing forward the energy transition. But even if you don't have a strong and independent bureaucracy, you could have institutions that allow for the compensation of industrial and energy losers. And here we argue that corporatist institutions can help with compensation. So countries that are based on a consensus model, like Sweden or Germany, are better able to work out arrangements where the winners from the energy transition or economic transition subsidize and compensate declining industries. So in Germany, this is a very pronounced pattern during the oil shocks and also during contemporary climate change politics, where the coal sector receives significant subsidies, but allows for a gradual decline. And this frees up the government to make significant investments in new energy sources. And on the other hand, in the UK, during the oil shocks, we see a very different adversarial pattern between the government and the coal sector, and the government ultimately adopts much more of a laissez-faire free market approach. So in our paper, we use network analysis to compare the patterns of connections between interest groups and the government in countries that had corporatist institutions and countries that did not have corporatist institutions. And I won't go through the analysis in great detail, but what we find is that in countries like Germany, interest groups are very much attached to the government, and even after the oil shock, it's very much the same group of interests who are accommodated in government policymaking. Whereas in the United Kingdom, which is not a consensus model, depending on which party is in power, the interest groups that are able to access policy change quite a bit. And this leads to significant policymaking volatility. The policy changes very frequently. And you also see this in the United States when Republicans come into office. There's a very different energy policy than when Democrats are in power. So the empirical analysis that we perform is what's called a diff and diff, a difference in differences analysis. And what we do is we take advantage of the fact that the oil shock essentially affected all countries relatively equally. And then we test whether the presence of insulation or compensation institutions affected demand side or supply side policymaking. And I won't go through the regression tables. I'll just summarize what we find. The findings on the demand side are that countries with proportional representation or welfare state, so one or the other, were able to increase gasoline taxes more rapidly, and the consequence of that, right? So decreased use of road fuels, for example. And on the supply side, countries that had a relatively more independent bureaucracy or corporatist institutions were better able to reduce their dependence on oil in power generation. So this is all consistent with our theoretical intuition. And in the paper, we supplement this with case studies of various countries and the use of discourse network analysis. And so for the diff and diff, the idea here is that if you have insulation or compensation, we would tend to observe policy change, transitional policies on the demand side or supply side. But if you are missing both of those types of institutions, then policy change becomes quite difficult. But the kind of policy that you implement ends up being different depending on whether you have insulation or compensation. If you're insulated, you could change the policy without paying off the losers. But in a compensatory environment, you would expect to see some kind of financial flow that compensates the interests that lose out from the transition. The general patterns that we find, and this is sort of the arbitrary combination of institutions that exist among OECD countries, is that we tend to see a cluster of countries that have a proportional electoral system and corporatist interest group intermediation. So these are countries like Germany and Denmark. And in these countries, we see both a demand and supply side transition. And because of corporatism, we see significant compensation of producer interests, but not necessarily compensation of consumers. On the other hand, we see in France a fairly unique pattern of institutions, which is characterized by very high insulation of the bureaucracy, but a majoritarian electoral system combined with a welfare state. And so on the consumer side in France, you can't ignore voters, but you can compensate them. And so we see a very large increase in the French welfare state during the oil shocks. But on the other hand, in countries like the United States and Australia, you have very limited transitions because these countries don't have either insulating or compensatory mechanisms. So the implications for climate change are as follows. So among high-income democracies, countries with proportional electoral rules have tended to adopt more ambitious climate change policies. So we argue that basically the effective political institutions for climate change have been quite similar to those of the oil shocks. And I've written on this as well as my co-author, Jared Finnegan. But bureaucratic insulation is also quite interesting. And here we see that countries or regions that have been able to create autonomous environmental bureaucracies have been able to better attain climate policymaking goals. So California within the United States, for example, compared to Germany, which has somewhat struggled in some respects. And my co-author, Jonas Meckling, has written on this topic. Corporatism has also played a similar role in contemporary climate change, much like the oil shocks, where Germany's phase out of coal has very much taken into account the interests of coal and proceeded as a compromise that gradually phases out coal, but in a way that supports both industry and workers in the coal sector. Finally, on the welfare state, this is probably the one factor that is quite different today compared to the 1970s, which is to say, because of budget deficits and austerity politics among OECD countries, there's much less scope to increase welfare spending as a compensation mechanism. And so compared to the 1970s, we tend to see much less of this today. So here's just some data to illustrate what we argue. So this is the number of national carbon taxes or emissions trading schemes by electoral system. So the solid line is proportional representation, and the dotted line is countries using majoritarian electoral systems. And we see that PR countries adopted these schemes both earlier and in greater numbers compared to majoritarian countries. Again, this is consistent with what we see during the 1970s. In terms of the effective carbon tax rate, it's a similar story. The Cox threshold here on the x-axis is a measure of how majoritarian your country is. So as you move up or move to the right on the x-axis, you have a more majoritarian electoral system. And the countries that are to the right tend to be those that also adopt a very low effective price on carbon. Okay, so I would like to briefly talk about what the implications are of all of this for Japanese energy policy making. And the punchline really is that the institutional context for Japan has changed quite a bit compared to the 1970s. So there are two major changes, we argue, that are important. One is electoral reform that took place in 1994, which shifted Japan from the SNT v. MMD electoral system, which was relatively proportional at the national level, to a mixed system that primarily emphasizes single-member districts. So Japan has moved from relatively proportional to a majoritarian electoral system. And in 1998, you have the Hashimoto administrative reforms, which significantly reduced the autonomy of Japanese bureaucracies like METI in favor of centralized authority among politicians, and especially the prime minister's office. So this has, we argue, changed Japan's institutional configuration as it confronted these two major energy challenges. During the oil shocks, because of its relatively proportional electoral system, Japan was able to implement relatively robust demand-side measures without necessarily having to compensate consumers. And this led to very high gasoline taxes, energy prices that encouraged energy conservation. On the supply side, the independent authority and policymaking authority of NITI allowed very robust supply side measures in coordination with industry. And so Japan was able to adopt a relatively robust demand side and supply side transition in response to the oil shocks. In contrast, for contemporary climate change, what we'd argue is that Japan is very constrained on the demand side because the electoral system now tends to be very majoritarian, and politicians are very sensitive about raising costs on consumers. The consumption tax is one where we see a lot of sensitivity from Japanese politicians, but gasoline taxes are another one where politicians are very much more sensitive now than they used to be. And because Japan has never really had a very strong welfare state, there's no mechanism to compensate consumers for higher energy costs either. So on the demand side, there's no institutions that really help with the transition. On the supply side, bureaucratic autonomy, like I said, has been weakened, and compensation is arguably still feasible because the bureaucracy has a close relationship with industry, but because of budgetary constraints, it's not as easy today for Japan to provide compensation to economic losers than it was in the 1970s. So the consequences of all of this are that the political context of Japanese energy policy making today looks a lot more like that of the United States than that of Japan in the 1970s. It's very difficult in Japan today to increase consumer energy prices through measures like the gasoline tax or a carbon tax. We've seen this in political debates. Even when taxes are adopted, they tend to be very low in international comparison. And compared to the 1970s, industries tied to fossil fuels have a stronger ability to obstruct transformational policies. The utility companies, for example, are better able to resist the adoption of new energy, particularly renewable energy. So the ambitious response that Japan undertook, and that's been well written about to the oil shocks, has not been matched by an ambitious response to climate change. So I won't go into great detail about the politics, but one example of this was, of course, the Democratic Party of Japan, DPJ's advocacy of reducing gasoline prices. That was one of their key platform issues when they came to power before the Abe government. But the Abe government has also not been very aggressive about increasing energy costs for consumers. So the political discussion around energy prices has been very consumer-oriented in modern or recent Japan. And if you look at the data on things like what are the costs associated with various energy inefficient transportation in Japan, so things like highway tolls, the automobile weight tax, and gasoline taxes used to be raised very routinely. It wasn't even subject to a great deal of political controversy. They would be raised every few years. But since the mid-1990s, these have all been pretty flat. And if anything, the discussion has focused on how much should we reduce these various charges. And in terms of automobile-related taxes, in terms of how much tax revenue automobile taxes raise, these have declined quite considerably in terms of weight tax and acquisition tax. And this has been done in a way to encourage the ownership of energy efficient vehicles. But in terms of the substitution effect away from public transportation, this has tended to encourage the use of automobiles rather than more energy efficient forms of transportation. Looking at household electricity prices, Japanese electricity prices used to be the highest in the entire world, but today they're about average or slightly higher than average as other countries have increased electricity prices primarily in response to climate change and efforts to encourage energy conservation. If we look at the supply side, of course, in the 1970s, Japan successfully reduced its dependence on Middle East oil by building up nuclear and shifting to other forms of energy like natural gas. But during the more recent period, as climate change concerns have intensified, there has not been an equally significant shift. For example, renewables in Japan still remains a fairly small share of the energy mix. And of course, the 2011 Fukushima disaster did not help because it shut down nuclear, which is obviously a source of energy that doesn't emit much carbon dioxide. But compared to other countries, Japan's share of renewable energy remains quite low and is not growing very significantly. Japan does better than South Korea, but compared to other OECD countries, and especially European countries, Japan's adoption of renewables has been relatively quite slow. And one thing that we do is we use something called the synthetic control method to examine Japan against a country that looks like Japan based on a weighted average of other countries' characteristics. And what we show here is that basically, based on what we knew about Japan around 1994 when electoral reform happened, carbon dioxide emissions intensity in Japan should have continued to fall. That's what other countries that look like Japan continued to do after the mid-1990s. But actual Japan, which is the dark line, has stagnated in terms of CO2 emissions intensity. So the progress has been surprisingly slow based on what we knew about Japan prior to this period. And if you look at things like expert evaluation of Japanese climate policy, so this is German Watch surveys international experts on their assessment of a country's domestic and international climate policy. Japan is ranked very low now. So there have been moments when the ranking was quite high. So during the DPJ government and in 2007, that might have been the first Abe government. Japan ranked among the top 30 or 20th percentile. But in recent years, Japan's reputation has suffered quite a bit, and it's regularly ranked towards the bottom of not just this ranking, but international climate change rankings due to criticisms, for example, of Japan's support for coal, but also just the lack of general progress on emissions reductions. Okay, so this is the final slide. So I presented a somewhat pessimistic picture in terms of Japanese energy policy, but I do think there is some case for optimism. And I would like to close by pointing out a few of these. So if you look at public opinion polls of the Japanese public, there's generally very high support for managing climate change. The Japanese public is not skeptical about the dangers of climate change like you see in some other countries, like the United States or Australia, for example. So there's strong public support. And we've also seen strong international criticism of Japan, and the current environment minister, Koizumi, for example, has attempted to use that as a way to draw attention to the issue and drum up greater support for an energy transition. So one consequence of the shift of authority away from the bureaucracy to politicians is that compared to Japan 30 years ago, in today's Japan, leadership by politicians can make a significant difference. And one thing that people who are very close to Prime Minister Abe tell me is that Abe is just personally not very interested in climate change. People who briefed Abe on climate change policy tell me that he just was not interested in prioritizing this issue if it would lead to lower economic growth, right? The priority has been very much on macroeconomic performance under the banner of Abenomics. And so if another prime minister comes to power, for example, Kono Taro or Koizumi Shinjiro, who appear to be more personally interested in environmental issues, there may be some scope for Japanese policy making to move in a more proactive direction on climate change. And in terms of the institutional context, the United Kingdom may be an interesting example because the UK in many ways has limited institutional support for climate change policies. Its majoritarian electoral system, the welfare state is not very strong, and it doesn't have such an independent bureaucracy. But the adoption of the 2008 Climate Change Act did appear to put greater support behind climate change. And it might serve as an interesting model for Japan. The idea here was to create legally binding targets to overcome these weak insulation and compensation institutions. And of course, the problem with this, of course, is that any law can be overturned. And so you need to create a law that has enough credibility not to be easily abandoned because of political reasons. But that kind of initiative may be something that Japan can learn from in thinking about how to create a political environment that's conducive to better climate change policy making. That's all. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting talk, presentation, and I enjoyed seeing the slides. And I now understand why Japan handles oil crisis pretty well, but now it seems to be that the Japanese government clearly is not dealing with climate change policy, or doesn't contribute much to the international effort to deal with climate change. So your argument clarified my question, like why Japan doesn't contribute much to this effort. So for the future of Japanese policy is somewhat pessimistic from your argument. The current institutional settings don't allow Japan much flexibility to, or maybe some institutions give some burden to politicians or Japanese policymakers to, for example, increase gasoline tax or the way or compensate industry. So I'm curious, what you think about what Japanese government or Japanese voters should do to deal with this situation under the current institutional setting.
Yeah, so I think the key characteristic of majoritarian systems is that politicians are very sensitive to the slight changes in how voters evaluate them, because there's something called seat vote disproportionality. If you lose 5% of the vote, that could lead to a very large loss in seat share in the Diet in the Japanese case. And so that's one of the key things that makes politicians sensitive about raising things like energy prices. But one characteristic of majoritarian systems is that you can implement fairly big policy changes without constraint. And so I think this is one thing that the UK illustrates to some degree. The 2008 law was a significant change. Once that was implemented, it's managed to stick. And so it's entirely possible that if Japan implements a law like this, given the public support behind climate change mitigation, that there could be enough public backing of that law that politicians would be able to maintain the framework. And under that framework, then they could say, well, sorry, in order to deal with climate change, we have to raise your prices, but it's because we're aiming for this very important goal. And so making that explicit connection between climate change mitigation and higher energy prices through a legal framework, a mechanism like the UK law, would be one important step. I think currently, if you raise gasoline taxes, people just think of it as an additional burden. And the connection between that and climate change isn't necessarily clear. And so making that connection explicit would be one thing. And I think clearly for Japan, one very important part of the solution needs to be investment in renewable energy. And it's some area where Japan lags behind other advanced industrialized countries. And here I think it's really the government's effort to kickstart the industry, because once you provide initial support and initial investment, what you do is you tend to create a self-reinforcing cycle, because you've created now stakeholders who want to support the transition and keep it going. This is what you see in Denmark, for example. They made very early investments in wind power. And once they did that, they had a very strong industry that wanted more wind power, which was absent in other countries that didn't make those initial investments. So kind of investing a lot of resources early can assist the transition by altering the political dynamics. So I think the institutional context is difficult, but I think the government can move forward by making selective investments in key areas.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, UK case is very interesting. Like a UK changed like policy direction even under the majoritarian rule. So it was like this act was introduced in 2008, still long before the Brexit issue. Mm-hmm. And curious, it may be because of the pressure coming from the EU or more like an independent.
Yeah, the law itself was not due to pressure from the European Union, but you raised a very important point, which is that the UK, having been part of the European Union, is subject to significant EU regulatory rules in terms of environmental policy and climate policy. And in that sense, it's very different from Japan, because Japan is not part of any regional integration project to the same degree. And so I think, from my perspective, one interesting question is what happens now with Brexit. So the UK does have a legal mechanism for pushing climate change forward, but it's also losing a lot of the regulatory framework that pushed the country along despite domestic politics. So I think this, in some cases, another paper to write is what happens now that the UK is no longer part of the European Union. But if it turns out that the EU was a very important factor, then unfortunately the story becomes even more pessimistic for Japan, because that is the sort of primary model to think about for a country with similar institutions that's managed to make some progress. But I think it's a little bit of both. To say the UK does have a little bit of domestic innovation, but it's certainly benefited from EU institutions as well.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe the United Nations could could be something like a EU institutions for Japan or US or Canada.
Well, it's probably it probably has to be a smaller framework. I mean, the UNFCCC process has basically been an attempt to create a global framework around climate change. The problem, of course, is that it becomes a very lowest common denominator type of exercise where you try to get everybody to agree, and all you can agree on is unenforceable agreements with self-declared targets and so forth. But if you think of a smaller group, for example, much of, if you can get the largest emitters on board, the United States, China, India, Japan, the European Union, you can cover a very large share of global emissions without covering a lot of actors. And so that kind of framework would just, let's deal with the big emitters and don't separate Annex 1 countries, which are developed countries, from developing countries, but let's just focus on the countries that are the biggest sources of emissions, and let's design a framework around those countries. That type of approach, where there aren't so many actors to deal with, that might be something that could be potentially useful from the international perspective.
So now I have some small questions. First one is like a figure 10. So you show that it's quite shocking to some extent that the highway tolls price doesn't change much after electoral reform. So it's very flat. But at the same time, I was curious. This is almost a period of that Japan experienced deflation. So maybe if you, I don't know if this is already adjusted inflation rate or something. Maybe that could be the reason why we observed a flat, no change after the reform period on highway tolls, or maybe wage tax or some other issues. So that might be the case. And actually, highway tolls, the price change or it's reduced, right? Around the 2010, I think it is under the Minshito period.
Yes.
So yeah, I was curious about the effect of deflation here, and a similar thing is a figure 12. So this is basically price based on US dollars, and curious about what happens if you change to a Japanese yen, because Japanese yen was very strong around the 2000, a dollar was just 80 yen or something. So this figure showed after the electoral reform, the trend seems to be very flat, but it could be because of a currency rate between Japanese yen and the US. So I'm just curious, but if you, because many Japanese consumers only focus on yen, and politicians also discuss issues in terms of yen rather than currency rate or something. So I was curious what happens if you change the currency rate in here.
Yeah, those are both really great questions. So on the first one about deflation, certainly deflation is a factor, right? Because the rate of general price changes has changed. But I didn't show it on the slide. But if you compare for example, Japanese highway tolls to other countries, it's very much the same story, which is to say, in the 1980s, Japanese highway tolls were by far the highest and most comprehensive in the world. But over time, other countries have begun to catch up to Japan. So it's not just deflation happened, and therefore, in terms of nominal prices, the level of these taxes and so forth have stagnated. There's also been an international shift where Japanese prices compared to other countries have declined. And I guess this is kind of the flip question on the electricity prices, which is if you look at electricity prices in terms of yen rather than in terms of US dollar, I'm trying to recall what the figure exactly looks like. But the interesting thing is that the overall price level is slightly declining, but it hasn't declined dramatically. But what has happened is that essentially the economic rents that are paid to Japanese utility companies have declined. And the reason why electricity prices are fairly flat is because energy costs increased during this period. So there's been a compositional shift in the price of Japanese electricity away from basically giving lots of financial support to utilities, which, as you know, are very strong supporters of the LDP. And it's without that energy increase that took place because of the early 2000s brief increase in oil prices and then the Fukushima crisis, electricity prices in Japan would have gone down much more dramatically. And so there's been this kind of balancing of factors where basically the government is no longer providing compensation to utility companies like it used to. But it hasn't quite resulted in dramatically lower electricity prices for Japanese consumers because you've had this counteracting effect from rising energy prices.
One more thing about your theory part. So in the theory, like electoral rules is one of the important sections. So because under the PR system, politicians don't pay much attention to backlash from voters because like electoral competition is like a more party-based rather than person-based. And I was curious about like a PR system often leads to coalition governments as well. Mm-hmm. Did you see any differences even among proportional like countries using PR system? Is there any differences between like a single party government or multi-party government or like a coalition government? Like
yeah, that's a really great question. So one thing that I've investigated, and this is not this paper, but it's my book project, is what exactly is it about proportional representation that tends to lead to more proactive energy policymaking on things like climate change. And one possible alternative explanation, which I think you're alluding to, could be that, for example, in PR systems, you're more likely to have green parties in coalition with the dominant party. And the Green Party could then attach environmental legislation to other policies and thus produce support for renewable energy or higher carbon taxes and so forth. And another mechanism could be that in PR systems, you're more likely to have left-leaning liberal parties in power compared to more majoritarian systems. And there is kind of a complicated literature about why that might be the case. And so this is something that I've examined. And there are a few cases, Germany and New Zealand, for example, where green parties have entered coalitions and had some effect on government policy making. But what I find is that it's very rare. there aren't too many cases where Green parties are part of a majority coalition. There's lots of Green parties, but usually they're very small and they're part of the minority. So there are a few cases where this might have mattered, but it's not enough to explain the general difference in outcomes that we see. And it's the same for the partisan lean. You can control for whether it's a left-leaning party or a right-leaning party, and it doesn't really change the basic association between PR systems and higher energy prices, for example. So I think both of those factors matter to some degree, but I think it's basically kind of all of the above. They all matter. It's not just one or the other.
Okay, so thank you so much for a very interesting talk and presentation. It's now time to close the seminar. So I'd like to thank Professor LIPSCY for his excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you as well for the excellent moderation.
Thank you.